Welcome to your cozy corner of calm. Here, you'll find gentle stories and the soothing sound of rain, created to help you unwind, ease your thoughts, and drift peacefully into sleep. If this space brings you comfort, consider subscribing so you'll always have a quiet place to return to. Now, make yourself comfortable, close your eyes, and let tonight's story carry you gently into rest. 1745. John Henderson stops at the door of his modest, eco-conscious condo. John leans forward slightly to allow the biometric scanner access to the unique pattern of his retina's blood vessels. After that identification process concludes, he places his left hand into a designated blinking outline on the scanner. After all 5 fingerprints in his palm lines have been analyzed and confirmed to be his, a mechatronic voice requests a verbal recognition code to which John responds. Alpha, Omega, Zeta, Mia, Zeta, Mephistopheles. The mechatronic voice accepts the code and then asks for John's key code on the 10-digit keypad, which extends from a high-density thermoplastic cover. John keys in his 16-digit code, and the mechatronic voice confirms, accepted. A card reader automatically extends from the metal door so John can finally insert a magnetically coded key card into a designated reading slot. Accepted rings out in response as a virtual doorknob appears at an ergonomically efficient elevation, specifically accommodating John's height. The 4 horizontal and 2 vertical bolt locks automatically retract. John grabs the virtual doorknob, and the computer-assisted hydraulics engage as John pulls the security door open. He steps into the foyer, and the door slowly shuts behind him to the tune of barely audible rhythms. As the door locks are re-engaged, the mechatronic voice informs John that all temporary memory data has been scrambled, deleted, reconstructed as unintelligible numbers and symbols, deleted again, and then magnetically wiped from the system. Concluding the lengthy process, the voice announces, "Your security door is sealed. All readings have been irretrievably erased, and your information has been safeguarded. Welcome home." Yeah, right. And my identity theft protection cooperative's fees will never increase, John responds sarcastically. What's that? I didn't hear you, dear. John's designated life partner, Carson, asks from their smart device-controlled kitchen. Nothing, John replies. I was just seeing if the piece of Technocraft Door's AI program had a sense of humor. Honey, you know how the sensitivity board feels about negative modifiers. What? You think they'll censure me for insulting the door? John retorts. How are they going to find out? Security doors are offline, at least for now. But who knows? Maybe next month's upgrade will include a rat-you-out feature. Carson wheels around and says, "Look, I'm worried you're going to slip up when there's someone around who'll report you. You know what they say, practice restraint, you'll avoid a complaint. Do it every time, you'll never get fined." John smirks and says, "Yeah, what a stump." Carson glares at him, so John revises, "I mean, stupendous saying that is." They both shake their heads. Carson looks down at the handheld electronic kitchen aid with the advanced artificial intelligence feature and begins conversing with it. John turns away slightly disgusted that even their daily dinner depends on a computer. He walks over to his favorite chair, which, sensing his approach, has modified its contours to accommodate John's body in an effort to provide maximum ergonomic comfort. As soon as John is settled in, a 3-dimensional media projector displays John's pre-programmed favorite, a personalized, life-sized newsreader. This amalgamation of pre-selected human traits appears to stand in front of John's chair and begins to relate the day's news narrative. John decides to disable the emotive feature. The 3D image begins imparting the news dispassionately like an old-school David Brinkley. John asseverates that's better. Classical expressionlessness. Hard to believe a programmer can string that many syllables together, much less envision it as a setting. Unfortunately, the next news item is actually a commercial break. The anchor states, "I'll be right back after these messages from the segment sponsor, HRC." Dewy-eyed, the muse of smiling, willowy 20-somethings suddenly fill the room. A lively young woman walks toward the projected image of waves gently rolling onto a shore. A svelte but robustly built young man meets her at the water's edge. She offers him a thin strip of what looks like a grilled meat-like substance. He takes it from her and slowly raises it to his lips. He takes a bite and appears to savor it deeply. Still chewing, he turns toward John, proffers a satisfied smile, and tells him it tastes great, but don't eat too much. Remember, thin is in. Geese, John quips. You'd think they'd be satisfied as the sole supplier of government-approved foodstuffs. But no, they need to sell it as sleek and sexy, so we'll be happy eating that slop. Dinner's ready, Carson announces. Speak of the devil, John mumbles. What dear? Carson asks. Dinner. Brought to you by HRC, I presume, John responds. Carson ignores the snarky remark and waves for him to come to the new virtual dining area, which was redesigned recently to be more in accord with recent style trends, as walls, fixtures, and furnishings for any residents are programmed using a 3D holographic environment simulator. Carson regularly updates their domestic dwelling. John often complains that he can't leave for long because he wouldn't recognize anything when he got home. Heeding Carson's request, John stands up and walks toward the designated dining area. The multimedia area is automatically set to energy saver mode whenever John leaves it. This delights John to no end because he can once again perform his nightly ritual. As John reaches the simulated threshold, he steps partway out of and then back into the media area several times, forcing the automation to turn the media center off, on, off, and then on again, blatantly wasting energy. John enjoys his joke at the expense of the Energy Cooperative's program. Carson, however, is not amused. Noticing the frown greeting him, John shrugs his shoulders and sheepishly joins Carson at the dinner table. I guess some green beans, or possibly a potato, is out of the question, John asks. Poor John. You know you're not supposed to talk like that, Carson responds. Look, John begins, when we were growing up, and they convinced everyone that eating dead animal flesh was morally repugnant, we all nodded our heads and went along with it. Then, it was birds. Can't eat such majestic flying creatures. Yeah, right. Like chickens eating their own feces is so majestic. But fine, we went along with it again. Then, it was fish because they had feelings, too. That left us with vegetables. I never cared much for veggie burgers, but it was better than nothing. Then, some geniuses decide there's scientific proof that plant life has a rudimentary will to survive. As enlightened people, we had to recognize their right to live out a natural life, whatever that means to a kudzu vine. So, vegetables are gone. Soon after, fruit gone. Finally, nuts, roots, grains, and tubers. Can't eat them either, I swear. Well, life, one by one, we've been talked out of eating just about everything except each other's worn-out synthetic shoes. Then, lo and behold, our benevolent room class is just the thing to meet all our nutritional needs. And voila, HRC is born. We've been eating whatever this slimy, salty pseudo-sausage is ever since. It's very easy to cook with, and it never tastes that bad, Carson interjects. No, you can grill it, fry it, bake it, and it still tastes the same. John sarcastically agrees. A cross between the old ham in a can and some sort of avocado oatmeal. John, stop yelling. Carson implores him. No. John, stop yelling. You don't know who might be passing by. John harums and then dejectedly slumps down in this virtual seat. Within seconds, an alarm sounds in response to John's ergonomically unsuitable position. So he sits up and the klaxon relaxes. Carson slides 5 thick strips of HRC sustenance onto his plate and tells John, I grilled them tonight. I think it's better grilled. What 5? John nods passively because he's really just too tired to argue anymore. Encouraged by John's acquiescence, Carson adds, I checked the latest survey on my KitchenAid, and it said that 54.14% preferred grill. John grins sardonically and retorts, yeah, but 54.14% of what? Carson responds with a bewildered expression. John explains, there could be house cats playing with the like button for all we know. Carson can't suppress a slight snicker at the mention of feline intervention, even though compelled to interject. You can't call them house cats. You know subjugating animals for domestic entertainment is illegal. Okay. John submits? They could be strong, independent, free-range felines occasionally frolicking about in their former homes, finding the like button irresistible for putty cat pawing practice. Is that better? Carson smiles, even though slightly troubled by the fact that eliciting humor from animal behavior is a form of species appropriation. Regardless, John quietly revels in his trivial victory over Carson's control. The two eventually smile at each other and proceed with supper as all are. For the moment, all right with what's left of their private world. 1:30, John and Carson abed at home, restless. Carson stares at John as he continues to snore far too loudly. The smell of his evening quota of alcohol continues to fill the room with a sour, guttural smell. Carson activates a non-eat intervention protocol to assist John with continuous positive airway pressure, something John forgot to do before he went to bed. Again. Regardless, the snoring soon subsides. Carson wonders silently, whatever did I see in this lumbering lout to make me think I could live my life with him? I mean, really, he's little more than a moron with nice biceps and a well-rounded bottom. Great sex society was never anything that special. A week banging it out in my cruise ship quarters should have been enough. Anything beyond that was just tempting fate. Now, here I am playing nursemaid to a dead from the neck up pseudo-intellectual with more meaningless degrees than a Caribbean vacation. No offense, but he's a nincompoop who can't tell a bass fiddle from a bull's ass when it comes to anything important. Every night it's the same thing. I'm treated to a litany of complaints against the state. Who does he think he's married to? I have to get up tomorrow, go into work, and pretend my husband isn't a raving lunatic raging against the system I work for. I have to reassure everyone. No, he's not a crazed radical. When it comes to the New World Order, he's an anti-establishmentarian. 6. Carson smiles and figures, if nothing else, that many syllables will cause enough people pause to let me escape continued questioning. Then in the Carson's furrowed brow returns with the realization that really isn't the problem. Sooner or later, this idiot is going to slip up and say shite that would shunt the shoals off their shift, and that could certainly turn our lives upside down. If only I could get him to shy away from further outbursts, then we might live the remains of our days peaceably, without recriminations. Wouldn't that be nice? At least a nice change. Well, if I can somehow get to sleep tonight, maybe I can dream about a life like that. Who knows? Anything can happen in a dream. Anyway, I'd better try to get some shut-eye soon, for tomorrow is heading toward me faster than colliding protons decaying into hadron jets and electrons. Looking down at the unconscious Hulk embedding a cyber impression into one half of their shared virtual mattress. Carson bids. Good night to you too, you quarrelsome oaf. I hope your dreams offer you some relief as well. 35. Cooperative for Disease Containment. Center for Health Statistics. Hallway outside Deputy Director's office. Carson is walking briskly down the hall when Emma from Analysis and Epidemiology runs up from behind and says, "Keep walking. We need to get into your office. I've got some juicy gossip." Carson stops, turns, and rebukes the young protege. For a scientist, you're awfully interested in teenage intrigue. Do you want to hear it or not? Emma retorts. After an obligatory eye roll, Carson begrudgingly relents. Okay, what is it? Emma herds Carson to the deputy director's office. orders the room simulator to enclose them behind a door which appears immediately, and creeps forward to whisper in Carson's ear. It's about Charlie's youngest, Marlon. Emma relays relishing a nitpick at the chief agency executive's expense. He's run away and joined up with the Wild. Carol 712, the Wild? Carson questions. I thought that was just an urban myth about some social malcontents acting out. Well, then Marlon just joined the hoi polloi of Unicorn University. Emma analogizes. Because he ain't at Notre Dame and nobody has seen him for weeks. That is until yesterday when he pushed open a grate and crawled out of an old sewer access hole. A security camera caught him and a friend foraging for food. I saved the video. Watch it and see. He looks a bit bedraggled, but it's definitely him. Carson watches the projected virtual screen output from Emma's brain-computer interface, and is soon shocked at the implied masochism of Marlon's existence. Human beings dressed in rags eating scraps fallen on the road. What inhumanity could have caused this? You know Charlie better than any of us, Emma admits. You don't think he would ever... No. Carson immediately interjects. Charlie would never raise a hand in anger or lust toward that boy, no matter what the Moors allow today. Sorry, Emma apologizes contritely, but you know one of those is encouraged today, even though the young people will sometimes react so virulently against it. The other is railed against, but you can't get through a day when it isn't blamed for all our societal woes. But look, I wasn't judging. I hope you appreciate that. I do, Carson confirms. I'm just absolutely sure that the reason Marlon made a decision to do whatever it is he's doing had nothing to do with that. Well, I hope he comes to his senses soon, Emma says. He's a good guy. I hate to think of him out there living hard. Yeah, me too, Carson concurs. I'm going to try to catch Charlie before he gets too involved. I feel for him too. He probably needs a friend right now. Okay, Emma agrees. I gotta go back over some anomalies in the data we've collected anyway, so I'll meet up with you later. 8:18. The two exchange goodbyes, and then Emma makes her egress through the area where the simulated door manifested, but now dissolves, and the office returns to an open format floor plan. Carson walks behind her workspace interactive desk and waves her hand over it. Large virtual screens envelop her. After confirming her security clearance protocols, she uses a stylus to connect to the data cloud and access yesterday's work. K85, Executive Director's Office. Carson lingers just outside Charlie's office, which has a default door for security purposes. He motions for Carson to come in, and a virtual doorknob appears. Once Carson is behind closed doors, Charlie warns, "We can only communicate face-to-face from now on. I'm glad you didn't try anything digital. That's probably being monitored already. What's going on?" Carson asks with a hint of desperation. Charlie gathers himself and begins, "You know about my son's disappearance, but I haven't seen you since he resurfaced, literally." "Yeah. Emma showed me some surveillance video. She said that he joined some crazy cult or something," Carson adds. "The Wild," Charlie confirms. So much for interagency investigative reports. Turns out there really is some sort of local cadre of militant anarcho-primitivists promulgating the practice of achieving a feral state through a process of rewilding. Ergo the name. Call them anti-establishment, decivilizers, or just fanatic Judeo-Christian preppers. Groups like this litter our history, but we thought they were nothing more than a nightmare from a less enlightened age. Now, my own son is one. "I'm so sorry, Charlie," Carson offers earnestly, trying to console him. "But he's at that age where they question everything. He'll eventually return to some sense of normalcy." "I'd like to believe that, but I honestly don't think so," Charlie decides. "Making matters worse, my wife is on the warpath. She's looking for answers and asking too many questions. It's bringing scrutiny down on me." 9. Nobody can blame you for a crazy college kid and his overly concerned mom, Carson declares. "It's not just that," Charlie confides. "Remember, there was that breach here a few weeks ago. and some information of a classified nature was leaked to civilians. That was contained. Carson interjects. So we thought, Charlie responds. But we were never able to fully figure out how it was done. With my son's reemergence and his known penchant for digital Dido, the prevailing opinion points to him, and, by association, me. There's already a move on to name Jen acting director, and it make me take a sabbatical. So sooner or later, we won't be able to talk in the office anymore either. You should really think about distancing yourself. No, Carson insists. There's got to be a way to get you out of this, and you'll need my help to do it. Okay, if you're sure you want to do this, I think I might have a chance if we move quickly. Charlie confides. Do you know the construction site just east of here? Carson nods affirmatively, so Charlie continues. That site uses red tape streamers on the barricades to make sure people see the virtual barrier. But the frame and the streamers are real. On the last one closest to the center, I'll tie an off-red streamer there amongst the others when we need to meet. The color will be just slightly different, so it won't draw attention. But it will be enough for you to know that we need to meet. Once you notice it, go to that same secure location at the same designated time we've been using. Nobody knows about it, and we both know how to get there without being seen. Okay? Carson nods and affirms. I'll be there whenever you need me. Thank you. I will hold you to that, Charlie responds with an anxious smile. You'd better get back to your office. Today isn't going to be pretty, but no matter what, wait for me to signal you. Carson agrees and dashes out to avoid any more exposure to inquiring eyes. Charlie acts like he's engaged in managerial meeting documentation and fights the urge to look up from his make-believe busy work. Carson likewise stifles the impulse to look back at Charlie and continues down the hall. 1155 corner table with a view of a waterfall. Thanks for meeting me here. I know you don't normally take a lunch break, Emma acknowledges. Well, thin is in. And all that, but you sounded like it was urgent, so I figured I better find out what had you so upset. And if it's risky, you're right. There's too much noise here for anyone to listen. So, what's so important that we needed to be this discreet? Carson asks. Emma looks around and makes sure no one in their immediate vicinity is within earshot. And then whispers, I sent you a password-protected file. I used the old AES 256 encryption as a beard, so even if someone gets past, but they'll run right into AS 512 encryption, which nobody has cracked yet. I borrowed a pen and a scrap sheet of contract signature paper from legal. I wrote down the password. It's under your napkin. Carson surreptitiously retrieves the outmoded disposable response to a recent spate of counterfeit electronic signatures. Without looking down, Carson slips the note into her pocket. Emma heaves a slight sigh of relief, as if a great burden had been lifted. She continues, Now, it's on you, and I don't have to worry about it anymore. The micro-external drive with all the data files is in your lab coat's left pocket. I slipped it in there this morning. Upon hearing this, Carson glares at Emma disapprovingly. Emma asks, feigning innocence. You're right-handed, and you almost never put anything in that pocket. So I knew it'd be safe there. Besides, I needed to confirm the data before I said anything to you. A1109A's Carson deduces. Yeah, Emma confirms but clarifies. Only they're not anomalies. In fact, the data is clear evidence that there is a problem. I've double-checked confidence intervals, made sure the sampling wasn't skewed everything. What we're calling subtype Spencone 197J is spreading. We missed it in part because the incubation period can be 2 to 12 years, or perhaps even longer, and it only manifested recently. It has the potential to become a pandemic, even though I don't think it's a virus, or even bacterial. Carson carefully studies the young protégé's face and asks, What do you think it is? A prion disease? Emma blurts out. I've run some projection rates and mortality models and compared it to known outbreaks in the past. The same answer keeps coming up, Kuru. Kuru, Carson questions. Isn't that... Yes. A prion disease afflicting the 4 people who lived in the eastern islands of Papua, New Guinea, in the first half of the 20th century. It probably began with one individual suffering an extremely rare occurrence. A protein in their brain spontaneously folded abnormally and contorted itself into a beta-shaped sheet instead of a normal helix-shaped structure. The misfolded protein incites any similar encountered proteins to adopt the sheet configuration. As the sheets accumulate, they clump together, forming sticky deposits called plaques, which cause brain tissue shrinkage and deterioration into a sponge-like state. Yes, I'm well aware, Carson declares, with a hint of indignation. My question was going to be rhetorical, but thanks for jumping in there with a disease history 101 lesson. I didn't mean any offense, Emma insists. I guess that sounded one part OCD and one part impudence. But I've just been living with the implications of this research for so long. It's been creeping me out. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to come off as an alarmist, given the sensationalized reports in the media the last few weeks. So I've kept it to myself, until now. 12. Well, I appreciate you bringing this to me first, Carson says graciously. Frankly, you're the only one I feel like I can trust, Emma asserts. Any other bureaucratic bigwig would be dismissive or worse, particularly now that Charlie's been put in the Grand Poobah portal. You've heard already, Carson asks. Charlie's poop journal makes the hourly gossip rounds. His sabbatical was a breaking news extra around here. Yeah, that's how it is, Carson laments. What a shame. Yeah, I think so too, Emma agrees. Well, I better get back to the monkey grinder before anybody realizes I'm gone. Carson smiles, but then queries Emma. Kuru was spread via contact with infected tissues, wasn't it? You could put it that way, Emma consents, but then elucidates. The 4 practiced ritual cannibalism. But I think you know that already. Carson nods, and then Emma exits, certain they both understand the grave nature of the situation. Hawaii, 1745, walkway, outside center, against the setting sun. A silhouette strides briskly past the east side of the center, and then its perimeter. A construction site lies just beyond, even though it can't be seen. Carson's composed countenance belies the concern and racing thoughts typical of a troubled mind. The method-acting classes have served well. At least so far, Carson has been able to play the part of a calm, cool agency executive, detached from the recent controversies swirling around everyone else. Emma's revelations threaten to change all that. Carson passes by a grouping of red streamers without looking down. After taking a few steps more, Carson stops and looks out at the site, pretending to assess the progress. Carson drops his stylus, bends down to pick it up, glances quickly to the left, and then surveys the site once more. Carson proceeds to walk back inside the perimeter of the center grounds and reactivates an embedded communication device. 13. After pressing a preset, Carson informs John, I'm going to be stuck in a late meeting, so you'll have to fend for yourself tonight. I'm not sure when I'll get home, but I'll try to call when I'm on my way if it isn't too late. 1935. An abandoned industrial site scheduled for future demolition and redevelopment. Marlon, Emma whispers. I'm here, Marlon responds as he saunters out from a shadow and into the light of the pole. Emma moves toward him, but is immediately put off by the smell. Sheesh, what is that? I'm sorry. Came directly here from the project. I didn't want to be late, Marlon replies. Oh, that's all right, Emma tells him as she looks around cautiously. Noticing her concern, Marlon assures her it's safe. The surveillance has been disabled for weeks. That's what you said about the sewer grate site, and you see what happened there, Emma argues. Yeah, that was weird. It's not like repair drones hovered there. It must have been some overzealous supervisor who fixed it in passing. Regardless, we're being more careful now, using remote energy detectors and such, Marlon explains. Once the project is finished, We should be able to maneuver anywhere inside or outside of the megalopolis. If you say so. Emma tentatively agrees and cranes her neck to give him a kiss. He reciprocates and begins to hug her, but she excitedly pulls away to say, "I've brought the entire dossier, including my research. I'm glad, but it will only confirm what we already suspected," Marlon laments. "Yes, but this is actual proof that there's substance to your suspicions," Emma affirms. Marlon shakes his head and says, sadly, "People believe what they want to believe. And there's a lot of walking dead out there who don't want to know the truth. We're 14, but people are dying, and there's a lot more of that to come." Emma passionately insists. "Yes, because we lack guiding principles," Marlon asserts. "There is an order, and when it's ignored or disrupted, bad things are bound to happen." "Oh geez, not the herbivore conundrum again," Emma pleads. "Plants feed on energy from the sun," Marlon begins. "Herbivores are designed to derive nutrients, including protein, by digesting plant cells. That is the direct means to their sustained health. Feed them something else, and you introduce a variable that disrupts the food chain. I know about the bovine spongiform encephalopathy breakouts of the late 20th century. But there was never conclusive evidence that it was spread by anything other than contaminated feed from infected cattle," Emma maintains. "I mean, I get it. Plants feed on the sun. Herbivores eat plants. Carnivores are designed to eat herbivores. When carnivores eat carnivores, they are once removed from digestive efficiency when they are forced to eat their own species. They are twice removed from efficiency and bound to become extinct. It makes for a nice soundbite, but it's not very scientific. Techne, Marlon scoffs. The least endeavor of the mind. When you rely on far too much. Remember Rabelais. Science without conscience is but the ruin of the soul. Rationalized evil destroys from the inside, and there is no cure. I love how eloquently you can insult my profession and life's work. You really do have a quote for every occasion. Thank you, Bartlett's," Emma chides. "You're pretty quick with a comeback for a technocrat," Marlon says with an appreciative smirk on his face. "I practiced that one in front of the mirror," Emma discloses. Marlon snickers and nods affirmatively. He then remembers and tells Emma, "I know you're not going to like this, but I need to show you something. It's crucial for you to see it for yourself. Come with me." Pod 15U, Emma nervously complies. They climb down a shaft to a subfloor. Marlon pulls up a rusted metal cover, revealing a subterranean accessway. Marlon navigates the narrow entrance and descends the long ladder to a series of electrical access shafts. Marlon grabs the torch implement from the stand where he left it. The two proceed on foot, traversing a veritable underground superhighway. Finally, Marlon stops at an access point. He looks at Emma and says, "This is where we traced subtype Spencon 97G to its source. It took us a while to gain access, but we acquired incontrovertible proof that it's coming from here." Marlon reaches into his pocket and pulls out a brain-computer interface he removed from its subcutaneous insert weeks ago. Upon seeing it, Emma asks, "How did you remove that?" Painfully, he responds as he connects it to a docking module recently installed behind a crevasse in the wall. Eventually, images begin to materialize. Marlon steps aside so Emma can see and manipulate the three-dimensional projections. Scenes of workstations, production locations, rates and capacity reports, and even stockholder disclosures pop up, all bearing a well-known logo. Finally, a video report marked confidential. Trade secrets. No unauthorized access or dissemination under penalty of law subject to GI 10098A. Emma watches a history of the research for a new product and reads some of the testing data. Then she watches as untold rows of obviously pregnant women are inclined to await some kind of gynecological examination. A simulation of a robotic procedure begins, and within seconds Emma realizes, HRC's harvesting fetuses? She asks, already knowing the answer. Yes, Marlon responds evenly with just an intimation of sadness. They have farms around the world. mostly in poorer countries. They process the remains along with some cloned or grown simulation thereof, rendering it as foodstuff. All 16? What about the women, Emma asks. From what I've been able to glean, they remain in an almost constant state of pregnancy. That is until the scar tissue builds up to a point where the womb is inhospitable, Marlon explains. They also use artificial wombs, but the higher grades come from human gestation. There's also something about maintaining a sustainable breeding population. Emma's eyes dart back and forth as she assimilates the information and incorporates it with her data. She begins to deduce. So the disease is essentially mad cow. Marlon interjects, tapping his right index finger against his temple. At least some mutated form of it. They try to neutralize the effect with GON 127V, which is a gene mutation that replaces a single amino acid in the DNA chains that make up the proteins that are vulnerable to prion diseases like Kuru. Researchers inserted this gene into the genome of transgenic mice in the lab. They found that GON 127V conferred complete immunity to human prion diseases in the carriers of the mutation. So, they thought they had it all worked out. Unfortunately, they were wrong. Given the political climate at the time and environmental pressure groups, HRC was able to get waivers and put the product out. They were even granted exclusive rights and government protection from prosecution. And that reference to GI 10,098 is important too. Best I can figure is it's some kind of initiative that gives the whole project top secret status, which means that what you did tonight could be construed as a breach of Homeland Security. Then going back to the center, Emma entreats. You can't, Marlon asserts. If you go there, home, or anywhere else, you won't stand a chance. Your only option is to disappear. What do you mean? Emma asks. Welcome to the wild, Marlon announces as shadowy figures who've been observing Emma and her responses now stealthily creep out of every nook and cranny to welcome her. Marlon tells her, there are those above us who say that we're a throwback to the past, but they'll soon learn that we are the future. 1733-3. 3 solar days later, Executive Director's Office. Good to have you back, Carson tells Charlie. Jen wasn't nearly as gracious, Charlie reports. I'm pretty sure she got a little too used to sitting in my seat. Well, better to be acting director for a day than never at all. I understand your wife is recovering, Carson comments. Yeah, going to be a long process after a breakdown like that, and there are pending charges upon her recovery, Charlie explains. I understand that you've been cleared of any culpability in that nasty business with your husband. Oh well, there was plenty of evidence to prove that he accessed Emma's office, and then tried to disseminate disinformation so he could profit from a decline in the IRC stock price. Carson notes, I never even saw John as a day trader, much less knew he was capable of market manipulation. What about how he manipulated my wife? Charlie asks. Oh yeah, Carson remembers. The affair thing. That was a nice touch. Emma's disappearance is a loose end, Charlie admits. But then so is my son. I don't think we have anything to worry about, Carson confides. You know as well as I do that there are way too many VIPs who have a vested interest in keeping this quiet. Charlie nods and agrees. I'm sure you're right. After all, Guy 10,098 is actually a Homeland Security executive order. So, sedition charges should scare anyone away from getting too close to it. Charlie grants himself one unguarded moment for a sardonic cackle, and then he looks back at Carson to ask, Hey, feel like getting dinner later? Not so much, Carson decides. Besides, Finn's in. The end, or maybe beginning.